Hello, and welcome to Limitless Talks. It's a podcast on limitless leadership and how experience becomes a growth lever in the boardroom. I am your host, Camila Ferreira, an award winning CX leader, an author of Long Live CX, and an international speaker. Today's topic is communication is clinical infrastructure. And to have this conversation with me, I have Devon Bruce. She's the founder and CEO of the English Communication Academy and a leading voice in global healthcare communication. Wow. So I have the pleasure, Devon, I have the pleasure to have you here. I kindly ask you to introduce yourself and let the audience know how you transform experience into business growth. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here and to talk about this. I'm Devon Bruce. I'm the founder and CEO of the English Communication Academy. We help non-native English speakers in healthcare communicate effectively with their patients, colleagues, and staff. We help the individual healthcare professional, and we work with the system itself. Now, in regards to the customer experience, we solely focus on communication breakdowns. So if the communication is not going effectively, then obviously that affects everything, right? So we focus on that so that way the organization itself can create the impact that it's looking for.
Wow, amazing. We were talking about this just before going live, and I was telling you, without communication, there is no business. So this is just to
100%.
say how relevant communication is, right?
Yes.
Okay, to get kind of a going and start this conversation, I have a few questions for you, but I also want to invite the audience to be present and engage with us. So if you have comments, if you have questions, don't be shy. Add them to the comment section and I will be tracking them and I'm going to bring the conversation here live with Devon. But to kick things off, let's talk about the topic. Why do you think that communication is clinical infrastructure?
I love this question, and it's a really great place to start because when I say communication is clinical infrastructure, I mean it's the structural layer that everything else rests on. So, for example, think about building a house, right? You can have a beautiful design, you can have high-end appliances, amazing walls, the best materials. But if the foundation is unstable, then everything above it becomes vulnerable. So communication in healthcare is that foundation. So that includes every diagnosis, every handoff, every consent conversation, every escalation. All of that moves through language. So if the information doesn't flow clearly, it doesn't matter how advanced the technology is, how skilled the clinician is, then the structure strains. So think about your house, for example, right? You don't think about the infrastructure of your house when everything's working, right? You only notice it when there's a crack. And so, for example, if there's a team discussing a care plan and everybody's nodding along, everything's fine, the meeting ends with no problems. And then a week later, there's an email saying, just to clarify something. Well, that's the crack in the infrastructure. So what I'm saying this in a nutshell is communication is not a soft skill. It's not optional. It's not even cosmetic. It literally is the operating system beneath clinical care.
Oh, absolutely. And I can't agree more with you. And it's the example you just shared is so timely because I am going through a remodeling in my new house and literally once we broke down the walls, that's when we saw that the infrastructure was not in a good shape. And of course, it brought some additional challenges that we were not forecasting or envisioning for this remodeling. And you were completely right. I would say that not only in healthcare, but in any other segment, in any other industry, communicating well is definitely the very first step. And if there is something, Devon, that I used to say, I normally say in one of my communication trainings as well, is that communicating clearly is just one step or the first step. Because the other thing, and I believe I want to hear this from you, in healthcare, you have very technical terms, and you have to translate this into, I would say, common language. Because if the practitioner, if the doctor just speak the technical language, most likely patient will not understand. So whenever you communicate very first step is communication this clearly. But the second one, which is very much important, and sometimes I feel like people do not pay enough attention to the second step, is confirming that the other party understood it as it is. Because whenever I say something,
Right.
most of the time I assume you're going to understand the way I would. And this is not necessarily true, right? So how do you handle that
Exactly.
in healthcare?
Like how to handle hesitation if it shows up.
Not hesitation, but this more technical language, because you were talking about communication.
Yes.
And right.
Yes.
So, and of course, among the practitioners, among the healthcare industry, you do have those technical terms, but those are not the terms that you can necessarily use with patients. So how to help your clients, or how to help the practitioners to actually understand and communicate in a way that patients would understand?
That's a really good question. So oftentimes when we're dealing with global teams, there is unfortunately this preconceived notion that you have to use these big, fancy, $1 million words in order to sound educated, in order to sound that like you're worthy enough to be in the room. And that is furthest from the truth. So if you have an international doctor and they're giving a patient a diagnosis and they're using these big fancy words, there's going to be a communication breakdown there. So the key is to keep it simple. Now that can be a hot take depending on the person, because that belief is so strong depending on the culture. But yes, the key is to keep it simple. Break it down, use simple, clear language, layman's terms, because clarity and understanding is by far the most important thing than using these big, fancy $1 million words to make it seem like you are worthy in the room. Because unfortunately, people feel like they have to prove themselves because there's a lot of invisible cognitive
limiting beliefs.
Yes, there's a lot of things going on in here. Do they understand what I'm saying? Is it my accent? Do they think less of me? All of that stuff is going on. But the patient doesn't really care about that. They only care about two main things. Do they care about me? And can they confidently answer my questions? If you can do those two things, you're golden. And the best way to do that is through clear, simple language.
I love it. Oh my goodness. Yes, I love it. And I can't agree more with you. I'm an immigrant here in the US, and sometimes I feel myself in that position when they start talking about this kind of a very wordy, and I'm like, what does it actually mean? Right.
Right. Yes. Yes. Exactly.
And speaking of communication, as I was saying before, one thing is keeping it simple, clear communication, validating that your audience has understood what you just said. And I think that in healthcare, it's also important that you explain what are the consequences when you give a diagnosis, what it means in real life, right? Because sometimes with the fancy words, we may leave the doctor kind of office not knowing what is next or what are the consequences to my life.
Exactly. And this reminds me of something that we did a while ago in the academy. We had like a think tank of people in healthcare, and it was talking about how to express empathy or sympathy in healthcare and understanding the difference. And we had a doctor speak up, and he said that it was really hard for him to express empathy in healthcare. And I asked him to explain that, and he said, well, for a number of things. First things first, I'm human first. And so I'm usually giving people the worst news of their life. So I'm human. And so I need to make sure that that line is there because I want to cry with them. I want to embrace them. I want to hug them, but I can't because I'm their doctor. That's number one. Number two, when they give the diagnosis, they are dealing with the patient's emotions. They're dealing with their family's emotions usually. And he said that's a lot to deal with also. And then number three, English is not his first language. And so not only is he dealing with all of these things, he's making sure, am I using the right context? Am I using the right tone? Am I using the right words? Am I coming across the right way? All of this load is in the background. And so he's like, it's so hard for me to express that because I've got all these other things going on. And it turned into a very beautiful moment in that session because everyone there was in healthcare, but not everyone was clinical. But they understood that line where you're a doctor versus a human, and then also that line of, am I being clear? And so it turned into a really amazing conversation about where people's lines were and how they dealt with that. And so it's just really great to be a part of those kinds of conversations because those are things that a lot of people normally don't think about.
Oh yeah, I work with customer experience, as you know, and what I normally say is, how much or how often do you put yourselves on your audience shoes, which is exactly this, right? So behind this doctor or that kind of a white clothes, you have a human, or maybe here in the US the green clothes, but in Brazil it's white. But there is a human behind that uniform, if you will. Right. So with feelings, and sometimes it's really hard to download the diagnosis or to give such a hard news to that person, to the family, and all the consequences of that diagnosis. And we forget there is someone behind that uniform. So I love, that must have been a very insightful and interesting conversation. And that's what I want to touch base next. So we were talking about how to communicate, not sounding wordy, even though people think that they must be wordy just to prove themselves, which is not necessarily true.
Right.
But sometimes, and I have gone through this, sometimes I feel like there is silence from the doctors. There is hesitation, and it gives me the impression that doctors are hiding something. So how is that? So what is I know that sometimes they must be a little bit more hesitant, but how to balance this in communication in healthcare?
Right. That's a really good question because silence and hesitation, they do show up in high pressure environments. And oftentimes it could be misinterpreted, which is unfortunate because in healthcare, silence, it's rarely neutral. So speed is often equated with competence, which makes sense, right? But the hesitation, it doesn't always mean uncertainty, especially when you're dealing with someone where English is not a first language. So going back to the example with the physician, right? Let's say they see a potential risk and they know the next step. Instead of saying something like, we need to change this now, they might say something like, I wonder we should consider, or maybe we should try. That subtle shift in language, that pause, that soft phrasing, that can be misread as doubt. But what could really be happening is just layered processing because they could be translating English in real time. They're scanning for hierarchy because depending on the culture, hierarchy is extremely important. They are choosing their words carefully. They're calculating how their tone could be received. They may be worried about their accent. So that cognitive load that we've been talking about, that's invisible. But the misinterpretation, that is seen. You see it because voices carry weight, ideas move quickly. So eventually, if that happens over time, people can feel misunderstood and they tend to speak less because they're being perceived as I'm not good enough when it could all be just they're processing information. So, and then adding another layer to that, if the system that they're in, depending on where they work, if they equate speed with certainty, then that clarity becomes biased towards certain communication styles. So the global healthcare professional may be the most competent person in the room, but because that cognitive load they carry is invisible and it's not doubt, it could just be them processing it more information, then that can have a lot of negative effects.
Oh, absolutely. And what I'm getting from you is that communication is a lot more than just saying words. Look up all the elements that needs to be taken into account. And here in the US, as we know, we have tons of immigrants. As you correctly said, English is not necessarily their first language. And we are not only dealing with the language, but with the cultural bias. In the US, we have immigrants from different countries. And it's not only about speaking a second language, but also the cultural bias, because hesitation or silence in one culture must mean something that is different in another culture.
Yes.
Right. And whenever we engage in that conversation, that can be very critical depending on the diagnosis. I can interpret silence in a way that is completely different than how the physician or the practitioner is kind of trying to communicate. And I have been myself in situations like this. When I first did my mammogram here in the US, I do remember the physician telling me, oh, you're going to have to do, I would encourage you to do a image screening. And I was like, why? What's going on? So you start asking so many questions. And it was just because it was the first one and it's kind of the procedure. But you see, depending on how you communicate and how the other party receives the communication, I think that part is also very much important. Kind of being transparent, as you correctly said, keep it simple. And I would add the cultural piece. So what it means to the other party.
Yes, we definitely do a lot of that kind of work. So for example, we had a surgeon. He was from a country in the Middle East, just to keep it anonymous. He was from the Middle East, and he moved. He's a surgeon here in the U.S., and he was getting a lot of complaints about his bedside manner, and he could not understand why he was getting complaints about his bedside manner, and it was keeping him up at night. It was causing him a great deal of stress, because he's like, this is my life's work. I was born to serve and to do this. So the fact that he was having all of these problems with that and with his staff, he couldn't understand it. Anyway, he started working with us. And once he learned that in English, we use our voice for clarity, meaning that we can say the same sentence 5 different ways and have 5 different meanings. Wow. That can greatly impact how someone receives the information. In his native language, they don't use their voice for clarity. It's like, just say the word, what you see is what you get, that's it. But in English, it's not like that. We have to use our voice clearly and use the right tone. So once he understood that and he really started working with that, his practice completely changed, because he understood that his tone was too harsh. And he wasn't meaning to do that, just because in his native language, he didn't have to worry about that. So it's those types of things that can cause major communication breakdowns, because they don't learn those things in textbooks.
Yes.
You know, they don't. And so that's where we come in to help with things like that.
Yeah, and not to mention that in any subject that you learn, in any new skill that you learn, 20% is from theory, but 70% is from doing it, practicing, right? So one thing is to explain what is the difference, culturally speaking, of communicating in your home country and you communicating here in the US. And then once you understand that, let's practice. Right? Let's kind of do some role plays. And I can tell you, I'm Brazilian. And when I compare the way we communicate here in the US and in Brazil and most Latin countries, to be honest, so Americans are more straightforward compared to how we communicate in Latin America. So, and I do remember in my early years of my career, I used to work for American companies, and I would kind of see the American communication very harsh in the beginning. But later on, by living here and understanding the culture, understanding the environment, I understood that they were not being harsh. This is part of their culture compared to mine. But look at this. When we compare Americans with Middle East, they are perceived as harsher than Americans. So those are the nuances that we definitely need to take into account when speaking or talking about communication.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. That reminds me of another person that we were working with. Where was she from? I don't really remember where she was from, but anyway, I remember. She was from someplace in Europe, and she thought when she was there, she was very fluent on paper. So she had a lot of high scores and everything like that. She moved to the US. She does breast cancer research. And when she moved here, she really struggled, because she's like, I don't understand what anybody is saying, because native English speakers, we speak in expressions, we speak in jargon. So we can have 3 different expressions layered on top of each other, and that's natural English for us. Whereas for her, she can learn those things in a textbook. So again, it's those cultural nuances that can cause so many communication breakdowns.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And this is a good segue to the third question that I have here. Actually, this one came from the audience, which is in global healthcare teams, how does hierarchy influence whether professionals speak up or stay quiet?
That's a phenomenal question. I love it. That's a great question. So hierarchy exists in every healthcare system, right? Because it organizes decision-making, it defines responsibility, it clarifies authority, but it also shapes psychological safety. And so in global teams, that hierarchy carries cultural meaning. We've discussed this a little bit before, but you're right. In some cultures, questioning a senior physician in front of others is considered disrespectful. But in others, that open debate is expected and even welcomed. So when those norms collide inside one clinical system, people start calculating risk before they speak. So imagine a globally trained clinician who notices something concerning during a care discussion. They're not unsure, they're not unprepared. They could be just internally assessing, is this my place to challenge? Will this disrupt the dynamic? Will I be interpreted correctly? That calculation takes time. But in high pressure environments, that time, like I said before, is visible. That pause is visible. That tone shift is visible. And so the internal processing is not visible. So when that hesitation could be just cultural conditioning interacting with hierarchy. And to take that a step further, if the system it assumes everyone experiences authority the same way, then it has a bias towards certain communication styles versus others. And then over time, that shapes influence. So that person who, how can I say this? So that who feels safe escalating, I should say, who feels safe to be invited, who speaks last, who speaks first, all of that is a part of it. So if someone repeatedly feels misunderstood or overridden, they speak less because the system that they're working in taught them that silence is safer than speaking up.
Wow. Oh my goodness. Look how much is behind just a simple communication, right? Which has nothing about being simple. Because first we start talking about language, that they may not be your first language. Then we talk about emotions from those physicians, from those practitioners. Then we talk about speaking or hesitating. And now we are talking about hierarchy. Everything impacts communication. And
everything, yes.
The experience from the patient perspective, because I always love to see from kind of the party involved perspective, it can be 30 seconds to a minute, right? When you get your diagnosis, when you kind of hear from the physician, it can go from 30 seconds to 1 or 2 minutes, or of course it can last longer. But just thinking of a minute of communication, how many things we have involved, how many things we have behind. And sometimes we not only have one person in the room, you have more people from the audience standpoint, but also from the physician. And you have the hierarchy, you have the feelings, the emotions, the language. It's a lot.
Yeah, and all of those things can cause communication breakdowns, which can really affect the structure of the system that they're operating in.
Yeah, and moreover, Devon, we are not talking about let me put it another way. We are talking about a potential life risk communication. So, right? So again, we are not just talking about regular communication. We can misstep the words and that wouldn't have a big impact. But when we talk about healthcare, it's quite important that you pay special attention to your communication, your body language. People forget that our body speaks. Right?
Yes, that's something that we also really lean in on is that the nonverbal cues can make all the difference, because something that a lot of people may not be aware of is that it's actually a nervous system issue. If you do not feel safe to speak up, or if you are so worried about having the wrong grammar rule or something like that, or if you're so worried about your boss getting on you because your handoff time is not not where it needs to be, then all of that can have a serious effect on your nervous system. So creating safety within the structure itself can completely transform the way global teams operate.
Oh, absolutely. I always say that before thinking or strategizing about the customer experience, in that case would be the patient experience, you have to strategize about the employee experience. How to create kind of
Yes.
a safe environment for them, how to kind of provide them the tools and the feedback. And as we were saying before, the role play, because once they are on the field, then time is over, right? So they are dealing
Right.
with real situations, and they must feel prepared and supported to deal with the challenge that you have to. Oh, I'm loving this
Right.
conversation. I'm learning so much.
Yeah.
So I am passionate
Oh,
about
thank
customer
you.
experience, and I'm learning a lot about healthcare, which is an industry I've never had the chance to work on, but I'm learning a lot from you. And I want to touch base now on communication responsibility. Because at least on my area of expertise on customer experience, there is this stand of blaming others and not necessarily taking
Yeah.
accountability for the communication. Oh, this is what somebody else told me, or this is how I was taught to do, or whatever, things along those lines. So how do you see the communication responsibility from the individual level and the leadership? So who is responsible for what, and how do you kind of coach your team or your audience on this?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because in most systems, they don't have a dashboard that's like clarity, right? A lot of people think that, that's not something that you normally measured. But as we've been talking about, communication shows up indirectly in the patterns that leaders already measure. For example, they measure escalation delays, they measure breakdowns and handoffs, repeated clarification loop. So if the same thing keeps repeated over and over and over again on the team, they also track staff burnout sometimes. That's linked to team dynamics. All of these things are not labeled as communication failures like on their dashboard. But the thing is, if it is considered a individual issue, like, oh, you need to learn some more English, like unfortunately some people say, oh, you need to learn some more English. Well, that's actually not the problem, because the communication is often the common thread. So to bring it back, if escalation pathways are slow, that's not just a clinical issue, it's a clarity issue. If a team is repeatedly misaligned on care plans, then that's not just complexity, that's information flow. So the measurable risk is not on a single person or a single metric, it's a pattern that you start noticing. And leaders, they already track those patterns. So it's not just the individual person with this problem. And so the shift here is recognizing that communication design, it influences everything. So just to be clear, I'm not saying that communication is the only factor in those patterns. No, it's not, because healthcare is very complex. And then the risk itself is very multi-layered. But communication, like we've been saying, is the channel that moves through every other factor. So I'm not saying that communication is the sole cause, but it is the connective tissue. And when that connective tissue is weak, then even the strongest system can feel that strain.
Absolutely. I would kind of go back to the first topic we talked about today, which is the house infrastructure, right? So are we providing to that physician, to that individual, the necessary infrastructure for him or her be successful
Yes.
when dealing with patients? And that's why I said before. So before strategizing for your client or patient experience, let's strategize for the employee experience. It's not a
Right.
game of blaming others, but a game for us to win on the patient experience. Right. And when we
Right.
approach things from that perspective, then you become way more collaborative and you kind of start paying attention to the details of your team. How do I support my team? How do I set my team up for success? Rather than blaming that
Yes.
one or the other did not do their job well. It's a completely different game.
100%. That's why I always say communication in healthcare is not a soft skill. It truly is infrastructure, because the individual person might be feeling that blame, but if their nervous system is not regulated because the system doesn't support them, then you have a system design issue, not
Absolutely.
necessarily that individual problem.
Yeah, and let's also kind of bring back the human part of the person who is behind the uniform. This
Right.
person may have had a bad day or dealing with renovation at the new house like me, or going through some personal challenges. So again, we cannot just remove the human part behind the uniform. And that's why I was saying
Yes.
before. So just behind a kind of a short communication that happens in the clinical room, there's so many things involved, which is not, and
So
it's
true.
far limited to the language only, right?
Yes. Couldn't agree with you more.
You see,
Yes.
I'm learning a lot from you today. This is amazing.
Thank you. Thank you. It's very rewarding work. We love helping the helpers in this way. Some of the
Oh,
best compliments that I've personally ever received, someone who worked with NICU babies, and they were getting a lot of complaints about their communication style. English was not their first language. And so she had to deal with potentially dying babies and having to tell the parents what's going on. And if you're not confident in that, you can only imagine the type of communication breakdowns that happen in
oh,
those situations. So anyway, the best compliment that I have ever received was, Devon, I really want to thank you because you helped me sleep better at night now. I can sleep
wow.
now. I'm a better
Wow.
doctor because now I know how to communicate in those situations. Some people think, oh, well, what's the big deal? You know, it's just communication. Even sometimes, oh, it's just English. But if you can imagine being in that situation where you are having to tell someone about their potentially dying newborn baby, and you do not have the confidence to say it in a way that will be effective, that is what we do. We make
Oh
sure
my
that
God.
clarity is essential and clarity is key, because again, communication is not a soft skill, it is infrastructure.
Yeah. No, God bless you and your team because this is such an amazing
Thank
job
you.
helping others communicate and kind of helping them build the confidence, right? Because again, you may train, you may attend kind of a workshops, but when the time comes, it's you and the patient and you having to deal with the situation with so many unknowns and so many uncontrollable things. You
Yeah.
do not know how the patient or the parent or the family member will react to that diagnosis or to the news. What are you going to have to do next, and how you are feeling inside, and how you control
Right.
your emotions to not communicate that to the patient. My goodness, it's a lot. It's a lot. So definitely, God bless you because it's an amazing
Thank you.
job. And just for
Thank
us to wrap
you.
up
Thank you so
things,
much.
because I am pretty sure we have. I have here this Donna saying 100%, just kind of showing her participation here. But just for us to wrap up things here, we do have hospital leaders and CEO watching this episode. What would be one piece of advice you would give them?
That's a great question. So if I were advising a hospital CEO, I wouldn't start with a massive overhaul. I would first start with visibility. Specifically, I would create a structured moment inside leadership meetings where dissent and clarification are expected. They're not optional. For example, before closing a meeting, just pause and ask your team, what are we missing? Is there a different perspective? Does anyone see a risk we haven't named? Because what often happens in these leadership meetings is what I call communication debt. You know, everyone nods along, everything's fine. And then a week later, there's an email that says, hello, just to clarify something,
Yeah.
that's not incompetence, that's just unresolved clarity. And
Yes.
that unresolved clarity is the communication debt that is always paid with interest. So again, I would just ask leaders to just have that time to ask what they're missing, because that one simple change reduces communication debt before the interest accumulates. And then over time, that strengthens clarity across the entire system.
Yeah, you just reminded me of a manager I had a few years ago, and she used to say, never assume, always check. And I think that I
Right.
carry this with me because, as I was saying before, the fact that you communicate, even if you think that you are communicating it clear, and you may be communicating it clearly, doesn't mean the other party understood the way they
Yeah.
should. So
Right.
validating, as you were saying, do not leave the room if you have questions. Let's address this because your question may be the question of somebody else. So one thing is, oh, let's align on the strategy, on the communication, on whatever it is, on the topic of the meeting. But before leaving the room, what is your understanding? Are we all on the same page? Let's not leave with unanswered questions out of this meeting. So I love it. And I think this is definitely a very good advice. Okay,
Thank you.
we won't believe, but we are approaching the end. Time always fly in this show, and I like because this was
Yeah,
a
this was
very
fun.
engaging conversation. But before
Yeah,
we
this was
leave,
great.
please tell the audience what are the most kind of exciting projects that you were working on. And I'm pretty sure that after this conversation, after this masterclass, people would love to engage with you. So, what is the best way to talk to Dev, connect with you, and get to know more about your business?
Oh, thank you. Something that we're working on in the academy, it's very exciting. I have someone on my team who has a product that's coming out. It's basically like an AI coach to help those with those high pressure environments, because a lot of times people want some sort of coaching, but they just don't have the time. And so what's being developed is a type of AI coach to help people in healthcare with those high pressure situations, like giving a diagnosis, how to perform well for an interview, things like that. So we're developing that. That's really exciting. And then in regards to where to reach me, I'm most active on LinkedIn. You can always reach me there. I'm on the platform pretty much every day.
Amazing. Yeah, that's how we got connected.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
So, Deb, I can't thank you enough. It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you so much for being here, for sharing all of these insights. I personally learned a lot
Thank
from
you.
healthcare today in just kind of a little bit over 30 minutes, and I'm pretty sure the audience did the same. So, thank you so much for being here. And
Thank you for having me. This was fun.
of course. And I see you all in the next episode. Stay tuned.